Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is AMD's Athlon 200GE, a fantastic affordable APU ideal for those who want to put together a cheap PC build using one of the latest and greatest platforms. It has 2 cores, 4 threads and built-in Radeon Vega 3 graphics, which means it can handle some light gaming with relative ease. This is Far Cry New Dawn, Ubisoft's latest AAA game release and successor to 2018's Far Cry 5. I've had the pleasure of testing it on a few different graphics cards already, but I couldn't wait to see if it could run on this $50 or £45 component. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. Now usually I use MSI Afterburner to measure the in-game statistics, CPU usage, GPU usage, etc, but we had a little issue. Usually to combat the 0% usage problem with AMD's GPUs, you can select this box in MSI Afterburner, but even after doing so, this didn't resolve the problem, so any accurate GPU usage recording was out of the window here. Looks like we'll be using Fraps for this part of the video. What I can tell you is that the CPU part of this APU was averaging around 60% usage during our benchmark test, whereas the onboard Vega 3 graphics were very likely maxed out. Nonetheless, 720p resolution with all low settings and 100% scaling was a no-go here. Out of 5 consecutive runs, the average frame rate of all of the averages was 21 FPS. Now this little APU isn't designed for such intensive workloads. This is simply a I wonder if this will work scenario. Plus, if you do have one of these and want to try the game out, it doesn't hurt to investigate the performance at least. All hope was not lost though, or should I say not all Hope County was lost. Get it? That's the game setting. Never mind. Reducing the resolution scale a little bit was my next idea. 0.9 or 90% was still a little bit laggy, but 80% seemed to iron out a few of the larger frame dips. And as we make our way through this first in-game level here, you can see the game hovered around the 30 FPS mark. This is the very opening scene actually after the introductory cutscenes, and I'm going to play a little bit here to give you more of an idea of performance in general. Now this is essentially an expansion to Far Cry 5, I believe it uses the same engine, same everything really, the map size is just a little bit smaller and the graphics certainly pop a little bit more. Everything is a little bit more vibrant and a little bit more colourful, and you'll see that a little later on. Now I don't want to give too much away in terms of the plot, so I'm going to try and keep things strictly to performance in what I'm going to talk about, and as you can see here, this opening level did fare quite well. The game sort of hovered between 25 and 35 frames per second. Now the frame rate will increase a little bit if you're looking up or down, as is usual with most titles. Interestingly, on Steam this game comes in at about 17 gigabytes when it's fully downloaded, but if you want to add the HD texture pack, which of course we haven't downloaded for this test, that will be a sort of extra 20 gigs. According to the official Steam page, the download size is around 20 gigs for the game itself, or 40 if you want those high def textures. If you're using a system like this one with an Athlon 200GE, then implementing and activating those high def textures probably isn't a good idea. After this initial level, we moved on to a more colourful daytime environment whereby the game seemed to perform very similar, though in intense combat scenarios you will likely see frame rates reduced to the low 20s, but general exploring seemed to be acceptable performance wise. I've taken a more casual approach to this video and I hope it pays off, because I'll actually be playing this over the weekend and this counts towards my overall progression. Constantly benchmarking games does admittedly take a bit of fun out of starting a new title for the very first time. And once again, I'd like to reiterate that performance will vary depending on where you are on the map, but thus far I've only had a chance to play the first couple of hours. As you can see, as the game opens up a little bit more here, the frame rate is still staying pretty solid at 30 FPS. I am using DDR4 2666MHz RAM. Now I haven't overclocked it for this video, but you should be able to squeeze a few more frames out of it. The reason I haven't done so is because I believe that most people buying this CPU will perhaps be going with an A320 board, and therefore overclocking won't be supported anyway. But of course, if you are buying something like this with a B350 or B450 motherboard with the intentions to upgrade later, then you may be able to squeeze a little bit more performance out of this thing. I'm just showing you how it runs at its absolute sort of base performance. Expect a few less frames again if you are using single channel DDR4 or just slower DDR4 in general. Next, I wondered how the game would fare when we threw this into the equation, an MSI GTX 1070. Would the CPU be able to hold its own when paired with this moderately powerful graphics card? Well, thankfully MSI Afterburner was back and working properly this time, and the first thing to do was once again select our graphical settings. I opted for the high preset here, again with anti-aliasing kept off, and 1080p resolution selected from the menu. The resolution scaling was at 100% and nothing else was changed, including field of view. Now what you'll see here is a more respectable performance, but one that isn't without its hiccups. Don't forget the Athlon 200GE is a dual-core CPU with 4 threads, so will struggle even when paired with a discrete graphics card in some games. It was certainly far from running at 100% usage though, but we couldn't quite hit that 60 FPS average at high with GTX 1070 and the same 2666 dual channel DDR4. The first thing I did here was of course run the benchmark test, which returned an average of 54 frames per second. Not too bad, and I believe that turning things down to medium with this graphics card and CPU combination would net you a 60 FPS average, but of course I think this is an unlikely pairing to begin with. I don't think many people out there would pair an Athlon 200 with a GTX 1070. I'd recommend something like a 1050 at most, but you know, what you do with your PC build is entirely up to you. I then moved on to the same gameplay level I had tested before, the second level after the opening one, and here we saw very similar performance, an average of around 50 to 60 FPS. It will shoot up to 70 in some situations, but it won't stay there for long. Now you're not really getting an improvement in graphics over Far Cry 5. It's pretty much just a reskin of the original game, but so far so good. I'm enjoying the story. As we move into a little bit more of a combat situation here, the frame rate does suffer, even with the 1070 installed. And this is likely where you'll see a few more hiccups due to the limitations of this dual-core 4-threaded $50 APU. I think though, it's done a pretty respectable job. On its own, it's the Vega 3 graphics that hold the CPU back, but once you add a discrete graphics card into the equation, you should start to see a little bit more of a performance increase, and one that's not to be sniffed at, put it that way, if you're in the market to put together a cheap entry-level PC. It's worth remembering though that you're not going to be paying that much more for a Ryzen 3 2200G, say £30 or £40, dollars or euros, and that will get you much better performance, put it that way. In fact, you may see in some titles, not this one, double the frame rate. And an improvement on top of that should you opt for a Ryzen 5 2400G, which in some cases I've seen go for about £100 here in the UK. All in all, I think the 200GE has surprised me here, especially performing on its own. I knew that it could run Far Cry 5, so it wasn't a surprise too much that it could run New Dawn, but if you've got one of these, you're looking to play this game, and you really don't mind how it looks, then by all means go for it, but bear in mind that I don't imagine many of you out there would be entirely happy with this thing's performance on its own. As I said before, I'd recommend pairing it with something like a GTX 1050, or if you want to opt with an older GPU, a 750 Ti is still a very respectable card and would be ideal for a CPU like the Athlon here. It's also worth quickly noting the previous overclocking result I showed you a little earlier on. We managed to get our Athlon 200GE stable at 3.8 GHz and saw a few more frames when it came to running the game on the CPU and the integrated Vega 3 graphics, but as you would imagine there really wasn't that much of an improvement. And of course you'd have to opt for a slightly more expensive B350 board, which in a lot of countries doesn't actually cost that much more. You're looking at about an extra tenner here in the UK. But if you do plan to upgrade to a Ryzen 3 or Ryzen 5 or even Ryzen 7 later on down the line, then it may be worth that little bit of an extra investment, so to speak. Nonetheless, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like on it, leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Let me know if there's any more modern and new releases you'd like to see tested with this APU, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.